Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the Gender Equity Unit's recently started series, Gender, Data, and Equity, Expert Conversations. The Gender Equity Unit, for those of you who are not familiar, is part of the Data for Health initiative and is funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies. We are located in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And our work aims to serve as a knowledge center and resource hub for all partners and countries in the Data for Health initiative and beyond to integrate gender equity into their health data work. We also provide capacity strengthening activities focused on gender equity for partner liaisons and key country players connected with Data for Health. And finally, we conduct research studies to demonstrate the importance of barriers to and strategies for advancing gender equity in global public health through data systems. We're so thrilled to have so many attendees from around the world today. Just a couple of notes from the top. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat throughout the conversation, and we will save them for the end. You are welcome to raise your hand when we do our Q&A and come off mute so that you can ask a question during that time. We'll also be sharing a very brief survey in the chat just to get a sense of where our audience is coming from, if you could take a minute to fill that out. So today we will be hosting a conversation with Eric Swanson. Eric is one of the co-founders of Open Data Watch. He supervises the research and analytical work of Open Data Watch and has published extensively on various topics on development data. He was previously a program manager and senior advisor in the World Bank's Development Data Group, and had responsibilities including the World Development Indicators. Eric holds a PhD in economics, and he has previously worked on topics of measuring educational achievement and economic modeling and forecasting. So please join me in welcoming Eric. Eric, so nice to have you this morning.
Then the first lesson is to unmute. Michelle, thank you. And I'm very glad to be here.
So let me ask you a very broad question first. What brought you to work on development and data?
Well, as for so many of us, it goes back to my PhD program, where as an economist or an economist in training and working on a dissertation, I realized how important data are to anything and everything we do, and how important the proper management and documentation and preservation of data can be. So that led me, and in turn, I wound up at the World Bank working on a project you mentioned a moment ago on trying to measure the literacy and numeracy retention of Egyptian primary school students, which may not sound much like an economics project, but under a kind of general banner of human capital. It was a very interesting project, and we had test results and family information for 10,000 students. So again, data in huge quantities. One thing leads to another, and I found myself in what became the Development Data Group at the World Bank, which is responsible for the global databases that the World Bank both uses internally, but also makes available to the rest of the world.
So we are focused on gender data primarily. So from your perspective, what does it mean to apply a gender lens to the work you're doing, particularly on national statistics?
Yeah, well, it kind of applies. We like to talk about the data value chain. In other words, not just the indicator or data set that you might have on your computer, but that whole process that begins from the first decision to collect data and then to prepare it for other people to use, disseminate it, and ultimately what impact it has on policies and outcomes. So when we think about a gender data lens, it really does begin with those first questions. What data should we be collecting? Where is it? Who's the person or organization responsible for that? And what is their own gender outlook? And then how do we handle that data and prepare it in a way that makes it most useful and appropriate for people who are analyzing it, making policies based upon it. And of course, these data also are very important for monitoring those policies. So one of the things that we look at is when you have, let's say, many countries have a gender plan or policy or gender equity plan. Does that plan actually include data? Do they talk about the data they need or are using? And what support are they providing themselves for improving their own gender data? So, as I said, when we apply a gender data lens, we look across the whole value chain to ask who's involved, how it's affecting people, how it can be used.
And so I assume you end up working with a lot of stakeholders to bring awareness to the importance of this gender data and then how to go about getting the data and using it. So really working across that chain requires a lot of stakeholders. It
does. And both at the international level and at the national level. So, we work very closely with the UN Women, for example, and the organizations or groups within the UN system that are working on gender data, including at WHO and ILO and other places like that. But a lot of our work is directly with national statistics offices. And we, with a group called Data 2X, have been supporting the Gender Data Network, which is a sort of collaborative that now has, and I'm sorry, my colleagues may correct me. Jay, if you're on, you can put into the chat how many countries are currently participating in the Gender Data Network, but it's 30 or 40, and these are gender experts or focal points in each of the NSOs, and we're trying to facilitate a collaboration so they can share information, share ideas, provide that kind of mutual assistance.
Mm-hmm. What about the focus on health outcomes? Why do you see gender data as being important to thinking about health?
Well, I sort of feel like I should reverse that and have you tell me that, but you and I both know some of the answer. And the first, the most important is, of course, that men's health and women's health and the health of non-binary people are not all the same. They have different health needs, they have different experiences, they have different outcomes. So it's really important to collect data that brings out those differences and, again, is actionable. It allows policies and programs to be based upon good evidence. And this is not just in the health domain, of course, that this is important because, for example, decision-making in the family is not the same for men or women. We need that kind of information as well. We need to know women's roles in the economy at large. Certainly one of the gaps, and a lot of our work is mapping gender data gaps, has been in areas like women's role as caregivers and the so-called care economy. That bumps up against health as well, because when we're talking about providing care, it's often providing healthcare in some form. So it's a very large area.
Yeah, and so you come from, you were trained as an economist,
Yeah.
and I imagine you have a very interdisciplinary team at Open Data Watch, and I have seen over the years, like, we're often coming at things from different angles, but if you're not working in those interdisciplinary teams, then you don't see the links between like economics or household decision making and how that could be tied into health as well.
Uh, yeah, I think it is important for everybody to think outside your silos, so to speak, and be open to seeing that in action when it happens. It's not just some narrow path that we're on. Deirdre Bell, who's from Open Data Watch, just put in the chat that we're 22 African and 22 Asian Pacific countries that are now part of the Gender Data Network, and she's got a link there.
Great, thank you. So from your work at Open Data Watch, you've been focused on this idea of open data. So why is publicly accessible data so important in your view?
Well, in our work on open data with my colleague Shada Badi goes back to the time that we were both at the World Bank, and the World Bank itself came under a lot of criticism for hoarding data, having big sets of data, but then not letting anybody else use them or demanding a price to use them. And, the realization that these data were most valuable when they were actually open and being used. And so we led the process of opening the World Bank's databases. And what we found, among other things, was that suddenly there was much more attention being paid to data because it was open and because people could use it. I will have to say, and I think this is something that would resonate with many of your listeners, the idea of open data didn't originate with us, and in such to an important way, it originates with scientists and the health community, that the so-called FAIR principles for basically scientific research are a kind of important underpinning to the whole idea of open data. So data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And now even the FAIR group is adding O on the end of it to say open, which means that you license it under terms like a Creative Commons license that says you can do anything you want with this, and you don't have to you don't have to pay for it. You're not restricted on using it. You can use it for commercial or non-commercial purposes. I'm sorry, I may have lost the thread of that question when I got started in open data, but our principles for open data have been well accepted, which are that the data should be machine readable in a non-proprietary format. It should be accompanied by adequate metadata to document it. You should have choices about how you download it, so that you can select the data you want. You don't just have to take somebody's selection. And finally, again, back to that idea of an open data license that permits you to do what you need to do with it. Again, what that does is it first of all, obviously, it makes data much more usable, and people find creative ways to use it. The second thing it does is it makes it auditable, in the sense that, and this is a question that often comes up, do we assess the quality of the data that we're reporting on? And the simple answer, although it's probably too simple, is no, we don't. But by making the data open, we allow every person who uses the data to make that assessment and report on what they find. And that in turn, we think leads to a virtuous cycle of improvements in data quality, simply by having users able to assess that quality itself.
Mm-hmm. Did that also create controversy? I mean, if data sets are accessible and people are scrutinizing them, much larger rates than
Mm.
maybe, back when we used to have all of our data in a filing cabinet and you'd publish it. And,
Yeah.
the couple of people reviewing your paper might take a closer look, but that's about it. Have you run into any controversies around what opening data might expose?
On our, there have been controversies. Some of the ones that have made it into the newspapers include misreporting, for example, of the consumer price index in Argentina. And again, because people could look at that data and then compare it to other information they had, they realized something funny was going on there. There were also controversies in Greece some years back over the construction of its national accounts, or the reporting of its national accounts. I don't have a good example for you in health statistics, but what we do know, because of multiple layers of data being available, that for example, if you look in countries, let's say infant mortality rates, you may get different reports from different sources on it. It's not to say that any one of them is wrong, but it's good to recognize that there are multiple results, multiple ways of collecting these data, and therefore have a chance to examine them more carefully. Where we get into controversy, speaking of Open Data Watch, has been that we're going out and looking at countries' data offerings and asking, what data are available and are they open? And for many countries, it came as a shock to find out that we didn't consider their data to be very open, for example. And so we've had back and forth, and we do technical assistance with countries to help them improve the quality in the sense of availability and openness of their data sets.
Yeah. And what about the connection to gender? What role do you see open data playing in achieving like sustainable development goals, for instance, that are relevant to gender?
Well, the SDGs are, important targets measured by data, by indicators that tell us where are we, how far are we from achieving those targets. And if you don't have the data, you don't know. And that's particularly true in the health domain. One of the interesting things that we found is that, and I guess at some point I'm gonna have to fill in the gap here and say, well, we do go out and we do assess the availability of statistics in 190 countries across 22 categories of statistics, including health statistics, reproductive health, and health facilities, and so forth. That one of the things we found is that some of these data are more available in low income and lower middle income countries than they are in the upper middle income and high income countries. And one of the reasons for that has been this very successful program over the years between UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster surveys and the DHS programs, largely sponsored by USAID, in producing regular and very high quality data about health and outcomes and gender and women's roles. And unfortunately, that doesn't always apply when it's not being supported by international organizations and running surveys on a regular basis. So we see a lot of gaps, and the SDGs have lots of gaps. Indicators that are just not available or not regularly collected or not collected on a standard basis. So we don't really know in some cases how well we're doing in approaching those targets.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can see how having some open data will highlight where the data are not available, and then more focus can be put there. Yeah.
Yes.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
I was going to switch gears a little bit. I understand you have a new venture called the Gender Data Compass. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so that fits right in because we have since 2015 we've conducted what we call the open data inventory. We've been doing that recently every other year, and that's this broad survey across 22 data categories of environmental statistics, economic statistics, social statistics, many of which have a gender element to them. And one of the things we look at is, are the data being, well, to put it simply, sex disaggregated? Because in most cases, in most countries, do not collect data except based upon essentially sex at birth. More recently, and in the last year, we took that same model and looked for 53 specifically gender relevant indicators, many of which are in the SDGs, but actually we have a broader scope than the SDGs in terms of the gender indicators we're looking at. But again, social indicators where it's relevant, economic indicators, and even indicators that come out of the environment. And now looking at those 53 indicators in particular, we go to each country's official websites. We ask, can we find them? Where do we find them? Are they sex disaggregated? Are they disaggregated by other characteristics? Because one of the other important evolutions in this whole approach, not just for us, but more broadly, has been to look at intersectionality. Do we have not only disaggregation by sex, but by ethnicity, for example, or by other disability status? Other relevant characteristics are very important for understanding the data themselves. So we look at that. We also ask, are the data disaggregated at the subnational level? Because again, within countries, there's big differences in outcomes for people. So it's important to have the data at that level. And finally, again, are they open? So we call this the Gender Data Compass, and I'll put a link to it in the chat. I just did. If you go there, you can see the results. You can see country by country results. And in each case, for each country, we have a set of recommendations for them on what they can do to improve their gender data systems.
That's great. Thank you. So you mentioned that for a lot of countries, it's sex data, sometimes disaggregated. Do you do anything to encourage collection of both sex and gender, especially in environments where, many cultures have additional genders that don't line up with a male-female binary? Do you do any work in encouraging gender in addition to sex data?
We encourage, and we've been working through the UN groups and our colleagues there to try to broaden that discussion to talk about what and how gender identities can be collected. As I'm sure you know, it may be controversial in some places. It's also complicated, so at the moment I don't have a good model to cite to say this is how it can be done or should be done, but it's something that is certainly being discussed, and I think we're going to see that evolving over time.
What about, I was just asking follow-up questions related to this compass. What about data lags? I know that's something that we struggle with in the US. A lot of our data coming out of the CDC, national level data on health statistics, it takes a very long time to see them, right? We saw a dashboard created during COVID that helped us to get data almost in real time, but it would be nice to get health indicators more rapidly for other health areas aside from COVID. Is that something that you tackle as well, the lag time between data and making it available or reporting on it?
Yes, although not at the interval that you're probably thinking of, or that we were all thinking about, for example, during the COVID pandemic. We ask how many observations on an indicator are available in the last 10 years and then in the last 5 years, and score countries higher if there are more data available, for example, in the last 5 years. But that still, realistically, for many of these indicators that have come through national statistical offices that have been collected through surveys, or even ones that are coming out of administrative data sets, a year, 2 years lag before they are readily available is still pretty common. I think that the point that you're getting at, the kind of much more immediate reporting, is almost a different system. It's one we should probably all collectively think about. How can we pay more attention to that? How can we encourage countries to do a better job at that? But we don't capture that kind of immediacy in the gender data compass. On the other hand, having time series data and consistently collecting data over time is also a very important process, and that's what we're capturing right now.
Yeah, I mean, even with DHS data sets, right? They're only collected every 5, 6, sometimes 8 years, and then you have the lag in when you're actually able to access the data, and so it makes it challenging, to see some progress in real time. Maybe with all of the digital technology and the collection of data using digital devices, we'll start to see more of that. But that's been something that I find challenging.
No, I'm sure that's true. And one thing we're trying to look at is also how can we encourage countries or organizations that sponsor surveys, or countries with administrative data, to provide more open access to those data. It gets into a complicated area having to do with confidentiality and privacy and that sort of thing. But if we could kind of skip a step and get direct access to the microdata, you would have faster results. And the other side of it is, again, speaking more to the science research community, and hearkening back to the FAIR principles, a lot of data and much more finely detailed data than we're talking about at the national statistics level is collected by researchers. And if you don't hoard that data, if you make it available as rapidly as you can, other people will use that, and we'll all be better off.
Yeah, so definitely some collective thinking required in that area. How does your work on improving data then translate to decisions that are made by country and global leadership, particularly as in pursuit of health or development goals? Can you give an example of how your work translates to that on the ground?
Well, one of the areas where certainly it's been important is in looking at schooling and educational opportunities, pointing out when you have the data where differences arise between girls and boys in their access and participation in schooling, and what needs to be done to change those programs. That was going back now many years. The part of the point of the work that I did in Egypt on literacy and numeracy was to basically disabuse people of the idea that children forgot what they learned in school. What we were able to establish was that they weren't getting educated while they were in school and then dropped out because of that. So, information can inform a lot of those kinds of decisions. More broadly, I think that it is the case that countries are trying to adapt and change their programs, activities, address the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that means both changing the data systems, or collecting the data to monitor the outcomes, and making changes in their methods of addressing those outcomes. So it's not something where you can just say, we did X and tomorrow Y is different. There's a long lead time in that, but over the years, for example, since I go back to what we've used to call the Millennium Development Goals, which came about in the year 2000, 2001, and tracked over the years the changes in infant and child mortality rates in countries. And, it was a very gratifying curve to see dropping down. Now, that in other ways, it wasn't, because we never moved as fast as the goals suggested we could or should.
Yeah.
But there have been big differences in outcomes across countries. And a part of that has to do with having the data to monitor and adjust programs to match.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, those were very ambitious goals, right? That probably moved more quickly than we, had the capacity for globally, but certainly being able to track data more regularly would help accelerate that. I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So what are the main gaps that you see persisting in data collection and monitoring, particularly in regards to gender data?
I'm sorry, ask me that question again. What?
What are the main gaps that you see persisting in data collection and monitoring, particularly in regards to gender data?
Oh, well, sorry, I'm having to pull that all together in my mind without having the benefit of my gender data compass in front of me. One of the areas where we see big gaps on the availability of data, it tends to be in two related areas, what we call the environment. And so that's areas about women's role, particularly in the agricultural area, and land use, and work on farms, and ownership and control of those assets. More generally, that's a big area of women's control of assets, or who actually has the control. We just don't have data. And then related to that, and this is another curiosity in a way, because a lot of data, particularly on economic outcomes, but also on things like safe water, sanitation, are collected at the household level. They tend not to differentiate between the experiences of men and women, or often, for example, we report on the basis of what the so-called head of household said. And that's true for consumption. So in poverty statistics, really important set of issues. We don't have any gender differentiated data. We don't know, are women able to, use the resources of the household, or how do they share those resources? Who's left out? Girls versus boys, men versus women. It's a big gap. It's partly the problem of data collection itself. These surveys tend to have to be household based, but getting people to reveal differences within the household is extremely complicated. But I would put that as one of the biggest gaps that we have.
Yeah. So you mentioned data on environmental issues. Can you say more about that? Like, what do we have any data that is starting to give us a picture of how gender dynamics play a role there? You mentioned land ownership.
Yeah, so that's one of the SDG indicators that some countries are now starting to address, actually using their own records in terms of land ownership, cadastral surveys, and so forth to see who really does have control of the land. Of course, it gets also mixed up with legal regimes and differences in who can register property and that sort of thing. Some other interesting indicators that have been around now for a while and don't often get as much attention as they should, but one is, for example, has to do with indoor air pollution. It is something that does get collected in some places. It's very important because women and children spend more time indoors, and especially when you have cooking that's based upon charcoal or wood or other indoor pollutants. I suppose we might even now add natural gas. There's differential effects with men. So we do look at both the built environment as well as the natural environment in this sense. It's a big area and one that has not been explored much with the gender lens, as we were saying earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, and I myself am interested in cooking spaces, ventilation. What does that mean for the pollutants that women are exposed to? What does that mean in terms of prediction of cancer for women as opposed to men? Not an area I've had time to explore, but certainly something of interest. So it would be great, if we start to see more data related to that. So we're going to open it up for questions. So audience, feel free to raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you. But I do see one question here in the chat from Iona. What are your thoughts on the most recent data available, talking about Peru? The latest gender statistics data are from 2020. And despite this, Peru appears in green. They're talking about the compass, indicating a positive sign of data openness. So Iona wants to know if they're interpreting this correctly.
Well, my colleague Lawrence saw that question go by and has jumped into the chat, and since I don't have the gender data compass open in front of me, I can't as easily refer to it. He says that it's lower, and this is sorry, let me back up. So he looked first at our open data inventory assessment, which is this broad assessment, which includes many non-gender related indicators, and says that it has a score of 61, which is above average, but still falls far short of perfect, which would be 100. And it scores lower on the gender data compass. And we find this across the board, by the way, that the scores on the gender data compass, when we look at just at sex disaggregated data, tend to be lower, both in availability and about the same, but often lower in openness as well. So that seems to be what's going on with Peru. And as I said earlier, for every country that was included, we have a country page that summarizes these results and also has a series of recommendations on what the country could do to improve their scores, both on the availability of data and on the openness.
Yeah, I see Lorenz sent a link related to that. So thank you, Lorenz. We have a question from Asta. Could you talk a little bit about how to capture the gender dynamics of climate change and how to understand and assess indicators of climate change?
Oh, a really good question. And we have been working with a group called Paris 21, which is the Partnership in Statistics for the 21st Century. They're based in Paris, but they're interest is global, and particularly in developing countries. And we've been trying to work with them on a project to identify relevant gender climate change indicators. I'm a little bit at a disadvantage of that, and I probably would call on Lawrence to say something about that, because he's been our point person on that project with Paris 21. Again, what we have is that issue of data that are collected at a very general level. And, you know, for example, who's at risk from the effects of climate change, whether we're talking about sea level rise or flooding or desertification or whatever. Methods and systematic, collection of data on some of those issues has really not begun yet, and is very much needed.
Yeah. So related to that, for people who are not data scientists necessarily, how can others help to promote equitable and strong data systems? Like, what would you recommend non-data scientists do to contribute to this?
So I've got a catchphrase for this, which I'm borrowing from a completely different purpose, which is, if you see something, say something.
Mm-hmm.
You are in a position to observe events and outcomes, you know, especially if you're working in the health area. You can see where there are differences between outcomes based upon sex or gender, and maybe data haven't been collected, or it's very observational and in a small sample. But it's important to speak up and say, hey, let's pay attention to this, and let's think about how we can collect data more effectively that will help us better understand what we're seeing. And also, you know, there's a way in which people believe numbers more than they believe qualitative reports, but the qualitative observations are really important, and they help to explain and drive data collection. So you don't have to be a data scientist to say something's going on here, we need to look at this more carefully.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've noticed that sometimes it's, you know, social media activism that pushes governments to collect data or to raise awareness on the fact that we just don't have the numbers on these things. You know, where are the data? So I feel like, you know, everyday people who are interested in these issues, if you're not seeing data on it, there are ways to make noise around that and say something, as you were saying.
Yes, and I see that Deirdre has put a link in the chat to a climate change focused brief based upon the Gender Data Compass. So refer people back to that as well.
Thank you. All right, as we're waiting for other questions from the audience, I have a couple of more.
No,
So what do you see as when we're thinking about national statistics systems around the world, what do you see as the main barriers and challenges to strengthening them, particularly when it comes to gender data?
Well, one that we're looking at very closely is financing itself. And actually, let me take a step back here and say, when we were just talking about the Gender Data Compass, I was putting more emphasis on the part of it that looked for availability and openness of data. But it has, our compass, unlike your conventional compass, has 5 points, not 4. And 2 of those are availability and openness, but the others have to do with the institutional systems to support gender data, the capacity itself to undertake data collection and management, and then finally, availability of financing for it. And we look across the board at all of those points, and the Gender Data Compass provides information country by country on our assessments of those elements as well. So on the institutional side, we're asking, first of all, what does the statistical law of the country say itself? Does it actually, perhaps in some cases, mention gender as a topic that should be included in this data system? Most often it doesn't, but we also ask, does it make any kind of provisions for coordination across agencies within the country, or sharing and collecting data? On the capacity side, some of the things we were talking about earlier, how often do they conduct surveys? Do they have and this is a very important area that we're working in, is civil registration and vital statistics, which are an important source of gender data for many purposes. And then finally, again, is financing available? And what we're finding is that it gets very thin. Financing to help developing countries in particular support their statistical systems, it really depends upon what the current flavor of the year is and which donor has decided to put an effort in what place. So, for example, we saw a lot of support coming in for part of which we attribute to gender data in Nepal, because the World Bank suddenly had a very big project in Nepal that included gender data as part of it. But that was just Nepal, and it was just the World Bank, and then the rest of the world, well, who knows? So yeah, you can't collect, manage, and disseminate data unless you provide support for your statistical systems. And it has to be both domestic and for poor countries, they need donor support from outside.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot to tackle, but it sounds like we're taking steps in the right direction. I have a question from Lily, who says men hold considerable power over the health choices of women in most African settings, and there's an increasing move to include the perspective of men in programs that have traditionally served women in order to facilitate their involvement. Do you think the representation of male perspectives, their data, for intervention development could further marginalize women? I don't know if this is within your purview. But...
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, of course, just on the simple statistical level, we look at two kinds of gendered statistics. Ones are the ones we've been just casually saying, sex disaggregated, or if we knew more, we would look at other gender identities. But then we also have a group of statistics that apply strictly to women, things like maternal mortality rates and fertility rates, and some others that are really focused on women's bodies, if you will. When we are talking about sex disaggregated, we have as much information about men as we have women, and we're collecting that all the time, and the data are available to use. Sex disaggregation is important for understanding men as well. Now, it's also, and I would agree, very important to understand more about, say, the decision-making processes within the family, or by men, by women. A much harder thing to get at, but it's something that we certainly need to know more about. And then what I think is important here, and remember when I was talking about the gender lens along the whole data value chain, that means that you need to have women and men involved in each of those steps. When you're making a decision about what to collect, what to monitor, how to go about collecting data, those are not decisions that should be made just by one group of people, whether one sex or one interest group. Communities should be involved, and all the members of the community should be involved. I'm a huge fan of Catherine D'Ignazio's and Lauren Klein's Data Feminism. I think there's a lot for all of us to learn from that.
Yeah, that's a great book. And if my colleagues Simone or Patrick are available, I think that book is open. So if you're able to find the link and put in the chat, that would be great to add. But yeah, I totally agree. So I know sometimes, you know, people will say, well, we need data on women and girls and women's issues first and foremost. But, you know, gender dynamics involve the role of men and masculinities in either facilitating, you know, the health of women or preventing it. And so we do need data from both perspectives in order to figure out, you know, how do we really make gender transformative interventions possible? So we need to understand the dynamics from both players, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I have one more question from Rajesh Sarang. Will there be any problems with data privacy and data protection while sharing more data in our more digital world? So since some data is more sensitive to women, should there be new data collection methods for gender data?
Yeah, very good questions. And as I hinted earlier, one of the things that we're struggling with is how to make microdata, survey results, but also administrative data more available and usable without endangering individuals by, you know, violating confidentiality or otherwise perhaps singling out groups that could then be attacked. So first of all, and this goes back to almost to the institutional setting, countries need to have good legal systems that specify protection of data and data privacy. And at the same time, those systems should be designed with the goal of making data accessible and usable, because we can have data be very private. It just means nobody will ever get any use out of it. And yeah, it's a hard nut to crack, particularly because there's been a lot of concern recently. You may have heard this discussion around the last census in the United States over whether or not you can really prevent disclosure of information, even when you disseminate it at a highly aggregated level. But I think this is where you need a combination of kind of statistical methods and legal systems and basically social norms that say it's important for us to have this information. It's also important for us not to violate people's personal privacy. But our goal really should be to make as much use of the information as we possibly can, because otherwise we're wasting it.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, new frontiers for us to explore. And I always say, you know, to ensure equity in those decisions, you have to think about who's at the decision-making tables when we're talking about data use, data collection, data use policies. Exactly. So gender certainly plays a role there as well. Well, Eric, I thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to everyone for attending and for your participation. Please sign up for our newsletter if you are not following us already, as well as on social media. You'll hear more about upcoming webinars. You can also check out the Open Data Watch newsletter. I believe that will be shared in the chat. Our next webinar is on May 13th with Dr. Joel Wong, who is a clinical psychologist that specializes in issues around masculinities and what that means for mental health for males, but also masculinities as it impacts the health of women as well. So thank you very much. And we hope you will join us again at our next session. Eric, thank you. I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.